The colony of New Haven sat on the edge of human space, a small world shared between humans and a few friendly alien species who had come to trade, study, and live in peace. It was a quiet place. Farms stretched across green hills. Children played near the market square. Alien traders walked beside human workers without fear. For years, New Haven had been proof that different species could live together. That peace ended in one night. Ships came out of the dark without warning. They did not send a message. They did not ask for surrender. They opened fire on the ground before anyone even knew they were there. The first alarm went off only seconds before the first building exploded. By the time the colony's small defense force reached their posts, half the market square was already burning. The attackers were known as the Skarn Collective, a group of raiders who believed that only strength gave a species the right to exist. They had watched New Haven for weeks, learning its patterns, waiting for the right moment. They did not care that most of the people below were unarmed. They did not care that many were children. To the Skarn, weakness was an invitation, and New Haven, with its open markets and unlocked doors, looked weak. Ambassador Elena Cho was in her office reviewing trade reports when the first explosion shook the building. She ran to the window and saw the sky lit orange. Ships she did not recognize moved low over the rooftops, firing down without pause. She grabbed the emergency comm and began shouting orders. But the base security network was already collapsing under the attack. Outside, Sergeant Marcus Reyes was leading a routine patrol near the eastern farms when the ships appeared overhead. He had only a dozen soldiers with him, armed with weapons meant for wildlife, not war. He watched in horror as beams of light tore through the greenhouse domes where farm workers had been tending crops only minutes before. There was no time to save them. There was barely time to run. By morning, New Haven was gone. Not destroyed completely. The raiders wanted to leave a message, not erase the colony entirely, but broken beyond recognition. Buildings lay in ruins. The market square where children used to play was a crater. Hundreds of colonists, human and alien alike, were dead. Hundreds more were wounded, some trapped beneath collapsed buildings for hours before rescue teams could reach them. Elena Cho survived by hiding in a reinforced shelter beneath the embassy with a group of terrified colonists. When she finally emerged, the smoke had not yet cleared. She walked through the ruins in silence, passing bodies covered with whatever cloth could be found, passing survivors sitting numbly in the dirt, too shocked to cry. Marcus Reyes found what remained of his patrol scattered near the farms. 3 of his soldiers had died trying to shield fleeing civilians. He knelt beside one of them, a young private named Sarah Kim, who had joined the service only a year before. She had died with her rifle still raised, still trying to protect people who had no chance of escaping the attack. The survivors gathered what supplies they could and sent an emergency signal to Earth. It would take days for the message to arrive, and more days for any kind of response. In the meantime, they buried their dead in the soft earth beside the ruined farms, using whatever markers they could find. There was no ceremony grand enough for what had happened. There was only grief. Word reached the nearby Galactic Council outpost within hours, faster than it reached Earth. Council officials expressed shock and sadness. They promised to open an investigation. They promised to bring the matter before the full council for review. But when Elena Cho, still covered in ash and dust, demanded immediate military support to defend against further attacks, the council representative hesitated. "We must follow proper procedure," the representative said. "An unauthorized military response could be seen as an act of aggression. We do not wish to escalate tensions." Elena stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. "They attacked children," she said. "They attacked people who had no way to fight back. And you are worried about escalating tensions?" The representative looked away. "The council understands your pain, but the Skarn Collective has allies who might see swift retaliation as provocation. We must be careful." It was the same answer the council always gave. Careful, patient, civilized. For decades, the council had preached restraint above all else, insisting that violence only led to more violence, that patience and diplomacy were the marks of an advanced species. Many species had followed this path, trusting that the council's slow processes would eventually bring justice. But justice, as Elena was learning, rarely came in time for the people who needed it most. Days passed. The council opened its investigation, as promised, but investigations took time. Reports had to be filed, testimony had to be gathered, legal experts had to determine whether the Skarn Collective's attack fell under existing treaties or required a new classification. Meanwhile, on New Haven, Survivors slept in the open, exposed to the elements, waiting for help that did not come. Marcus Reyes grew more furious with each passing day. He had spent his career believing in the values Earth had agreed to when it joined the wider galactic community: patience, restraint, cooperation. He had believed that these values made humanity better, more advanced than species who solved every problem with violence. But watching his fallen soldiers being lowered into the ground while alien officials debated procedure, he began to wonder if those values had simply made humanity an easy target. On the 6th day, a small supply ship finally arrived from Earth, carrying medical supplies, food, and a handful of personnel sent to assess the damage. Among them was Fleet Commander Aisha Bello, a decorated officer who had been sent not to fight, but to observe and report back to Earth's government. She walked through the wreckage of New Haven with a grim expression, taking note of the scale of destruction, the number of dead, the condition of the survivors. She found Elena Cho sitting near the ruins of the embassy, staring at a list of names. The confirmed dead, still growing as bodies continued to be found beneath the rubble. "I need you to tell Earth what happened here," Elena said quietly. "Not the official report. The truth. Tell them what it looked like. Tell them what it felt like." Commander Bello nodded slowly. "I will. And tell them the council did nothing," Elena added, her voice sharp with a grief that had begun to harden into something else. "Tell them that when our people were dying, the ones who promised to protect us were more worried about paperwork than survivors." Bello looked around at the wreckage, at the makeshift graves, at the exhausted, hollow-eyed survivors who had lost everything in a single night. She thought about the reports she had read before arriving, the ones that described the attack in cold, clinical language, numbers and statistics that could never capture the reality of what had actually happened here. "I will tell them everything," she said, "and I don't think Earth is going to wait for the Council's permission this time." As she said the words, she was not entirely certain they were true. Earth had always followed the rules, had always tried to be the responsible, patient member of the galactic community. But standing among the ruins of New Haven, surrounded by graves that should never have needed to be dug, she felt something shifting, not just in herself, but in the reports she would carry home, in the images that would soon reach every screen on Earth, in the questions that millions of people would soon be asking their leaders. Why did we wait? Why did we follow rules that only seemed to protect the ones willing to break them? And most importantly, what were they going to do about it? Far above New Haven, as the supply ship prepared for its return journey to Earth, Commander Bello looked out at the stars one last time. Somewhere out there, the Skarn Collective was already moving on, searching for their next target, confident that no real consequences would follow. They had learned, over years of council inaction, that humanity and its allies preferred words to action. That confidence, Bello thought grimly, might soon prove to be their greatest mistake. The supply ship's engines hummed to life, carrying with it not just survivors and reports, but the first sparks of something that would soon become impossible to ignore. Earth was about to receive the truth about New Haven, and for the first time in a long time, the truth alone might be enough to change everything. The images from New Haven reached Earth on a quiet Tuesday morning, and by nightfall, nothing about that quiet remained. Commander Bello's report, along with photographs and video taken by survivors, spread across every news network and public channel within hours. There was no way to soften what people saw. Burned homes, rows of makeshift graves, children's toys scattered in the dirt beside rubble that used to be a school. The council's official statement, promising a full investigation in due course, played right alongside the footage, and the contrast was more damning than any editorial could have written. Public anger did not build slowly, it exploded. Within a day, crowds gathered outside government buildings in every major city on Earth, demanding answers. Vigils were held for the dead, but they were not quiet, peaceful things. People wanted to know why a colony full of civilians had been left undefended. They wanted to know why the Council, which humanity had trusted for so long, had done nothing while people were dying. Most of all, they wanted to know what their own government intended to do about it. Inside the Earth Defense Council chamber, the mood was just as heated, though far more controlled. President Whitfield sat at the head of the long table, flanked by military leaders, diplomats, and intelligence officers. Commander Bello stood before them, having just finished delivering her full report in person. "The Council will not act in time to matter," Bello said flatly. "They are still debating jurisdiction. Meanwhile, the Skarn Collective is already regrouping, according to our scout ships. They have no reason to believe there will be consequences. Admiral Grant Okafor, the most senior military officer at the table, leaned forward. Then we make sure they believe otherwise. A murmur passed through the room. For decades, Earth had operated carefully within the framework the Galactic Council had established. Restrained military postures, non-aggression treaties, careful diplomatic protocols. Humanity had joined the wider galactic community as a newer, smaller power, and had spent years proving it could be trusted, could be reasonable, could be civilized by the Council's standards. That reputation had value. It had opened doors. It had also, as New Haven proved, left human colonies dangerously exposed. If we move without Council approval, said Diplomatic Secretary Layla Osei, we risk our standing with every allied species. We could be labeled an aggressor. Sanctions could follow. Trade routes could close. And if we wait for approval, Okafor replied, how many more colonies burn before the Council finishes filing paperwork? The room fell silent. Everyone understood the weight of that question. President Whitfield had said little throughout the meeting, listening carefully to every voice. She was not a woman who acted from emotion alone, and she understood the risks Secretary Osei had raised. But she had also seen the footage from New Haven. She had read the names of the dead, including 17 children under the age of 10. She had listened to Elena Cho's recorded message, the ambassador's voice shaking with a fury that no diplomat should ever have to carry. We did not build our fleets to sit and dock, Whitfield finally said. We built them because we knew a day like this might come. The Council has shown us, again, that they will protect their procedures before they protect people. I will not ask Earth's citizens to wait quietly while more of them die, for the sake of someone else's comfort. She turned to Admiral Okafor. Prepare the fleet. The room shifted instantly from debate to action. Secretary Osei raised one final concern. What message do we send to the Council? Whitfield considered this for a long moment. Tell them Earth, thanks them for their patience, but we no longer require their permission to protect our people. Tell them the age of asking nicely is over. That message was sent within the hour, and it spread through diplomatic channels faster than anyone expected. Alien officials who had long viewed humanity as a young, obedient species suddenly found themselves reading a statement that broke from decades of careful, restrained language. Many were stunned. A few, quietly, were relieved that someone had finally said what many had been thinking in private. Across Earth, the mobilization began. Shipyards that had operated at limited capacity for years suddenly ran around the clock. Reserve fleets, kept in storage under treaty limitations that the Council had encouraged humanity to accept, were brought back into active service. Soldiers who had spent years training for defense alone were now given new orders, new purpose. Sergeant Marcus Reyes, still recovering from the loss of his soldiers on New Haven, requested immediate reassignment to the response fleet. His request was approved without hesitation. Men and women with first-hand experience of the massacre were in high demand, both for their skill and for the weight their presence carried. When he arrived at the staging station orbiting Earth, he found it filled with more ships than he had ever seen gathered in one place. I didn't know we had this many, he admitted to a fellow officer as they walked the length of the primary hangar. Most of us didn't, she replied. Command kept a lot of this quiet. Guess they always knew a day might come when we'd need more than the Council allowed us to show. It was true. For years, Earth had followed the Council's guidelines on visible military strength, keeping most of its true capacity out of public and diplomatic view, officially to maintain peaceful relations. Many alien nations believed humanity's forces were modest, built mainly for local defense. That belief was about to be proven very wrong. Fleet Commander Bello was given command of the lead task force, a decision that surprised some given her background in diplomacy and observation, rather than direct combat leadership. But President Whitfield had chosen her deliberately. You saw what happened, Whitfield told her privately before departure. You understand why this matters more than any tactical officer could. I need someone leading this fleet who remembers exactly why we're going. Bello accepted the command with a solemn nod. She had spent the last week unable to stop thinking about the graves on New Haven, about Elena Cho's exhausted, grief-hardened voice asking why they had waited so long. She intended to make sure no one ever had to ask that question again. As the fleet prepared for departure, word came in through diplomatic channels that several allied species were requesting urgent talks, hoping to convince Earth to reconsider, to allow the Council process to continue. Secretary Osei handled these requests personally, her tone polite but unmovable. Earth remains open to peaceful resolution. she told each representative. But peaceful resolution requires the aggressor to face consequences. The Council has offered none. We will offer our own. One alien officer, a mid-level tactical advisor from a species long allied with Earth, was assigned to accompany the fleet as an official observer, a diplomatic gesture meant to reassure the wider galactic community that Earth's actions would be measured and lawful, not reckless. His name was Vect, and he had worked alongside human forces for over a decade. He had always found humans to be capable but restrained, more cautious than their reputation among some species suggested. Standing on the bridge of Bellows' flagship as the fleet assembled, Vect watched human crews move with a calm, methodical precision that unsettled him more than any display of anger could have. There was no shouting, no dramatic speeches, just quiet, focused preparation, ship after ship falling into formation with practiced efficiency. I expected more anger, Vect admitted to Bello as she reviewed final deployment reports. We're past anger, Bello replied, not looking up from her console. Anger gets people killed carelessly. This isn't about rage. It's about making sure this never happens again. Vect said nothing, but he found himself recalculating everything he thought he understood about humanity. He had always assumed Earth's careful, rule-following behavior reflected genuine limitation, a smaller, newer power making the wisest choice available to it. Watching the scale and precision of the fleet forming around him, he began to suspect something very different, that humanity had simply been waiting, patiently, restrained not by weakness but by choice, for a reason serious enough to stop holding back. Within 72 hours of Commander Bellows' report reaching Earth, the response fleet was ready to depart. It was a speed that stunned observers throughout the galaxy, especially those accustomed to the Council's slow, deliberate pace. Ships that many species didn't know Earth possessed lined up in formation, their numbers and capabilities carefully kept quiet until this very moment. Before departure, Bello addressed her assembled officers one final time, her voice steady over the fleet-wide comm. We are not going to New Haven's attackers to negotiate, she said. We are not going to ask for surrender terms or wait for Council approval on rules of engagement. We are going to make sure that anyone who believes attacking innocent people carries no consequence understands, permanently, that they were wrong. She paused, thinking briefly of Elena Cho, of Sergeant Reyes and his fallen soldiers, of the small graves dug into New Haven's soft earth. Prepare for departure, she said finally. It's time the galaxy learned exactly what happens when humanity stops waiting. The fleet's engines ignited in unison, a wall of light briefly illuminating the darkness of space, before the ships surged forward, faster and more coordinated than anything the wider galactic community had ever seen from Earth. Behind them, on the planet they left in silence, billions watched news broadcasts showing the departure, holding on to a single, unfamiliar feeling after days of grief and helpless anger. Hope, sharpened now into something closer to resolve. The journey to Skarn territory took 11 days, and in that time, the fleet did not slow down. News of Earth's mobilization spread quickly through the galaxy, carried by trade ships, diplomatic channels, and the kind of rumor that moves faster than official reports ever could. Species who had known humans mainly through cautious trade agreements and careful council meetings suddenly found themselves staring at intelligence reports describing a fleet larger and more advanced than anyone had accounted for. Numbers that didn't match old estimates. Ship classes that had never appeared in any registry shared with the council. Weapons systems that had existed only in classified budgets, built quietly over years under the cover of local defense upgrades. At a hastily called session of the Galactic Council, delegates argued over how to respond. Some demanded immediate condemnation of Earth's unilateral action. Others, more quietly, pointed out that the Council had done nothing to stop the Skarn Collective's attack in the first place, and perhaps had no moral standing to condemn anyone else for finally acting. They are moving outside all agreed protocols, one delegate insisted. They are moving to stop a group that murdered children while we debated jurisdiction, another replied. Perhaps the protocols failed, not Earth. No resolution was reached. The Council, true to its nature, decided to continue discussing the matter, even as Earth's fleet closed the distance to its target. Aboard the flagship, Commander Bello spent most of the journey reviewing intelligence with her senior staff. The Skarn Collective was not a single, unified nation, but a loose network of raider fleets, pirate lords, and mercenary bands who shared a common belief that strength alone determined the right to survive, and that weaker species existed to be taken from. They had preyed on smaller colonies for years, always careful to strike targets too small or too poorly defended to invite serious retaliation. New Haven had fit that pattern. Until it didn't. "Our scouts have located their primary staging point," said Intelligence Officer Priya Anand, pulling up a star map on the bridge display. "A fortified base, built into an asteroid cluster in the Vera system. It's where they gather before and after raids, resupply, and plan new targets." "Defenses?" Bello asked. "Heavier than what they used on New Haven, but still nothing built to withstand a coordinated fleet assault. They never expected anyone to bring the fight to them." Bello studied the display for a long moment. "Then we make sure they understand what that mistake costs." Sergeant Marcus Reyes, assigned to the ground assault teams that would move in once the fleet secured orbital control, spent much of the journey training with his new unit. Many of the soldiers around him had lost someone at New Haven, or knew someone who had. There was little need for speeches about motivation. Everyone in that unit understood exactly why they were there. During one training session, a younger soldier named Private Tomas Alvarez asked Reyes a question that had clearly been sitting heavy on his mind. "Sergeant, are we better than them if we do the same thing they did? Attack and don't stop?" Reyes considered the question carefully before answering. "We're not going in to kill people who surrender. We're not going in to hurt anyone who isn't trying to hurt us. But we are going in to make sure the people who planned New Haven never get the chance to plan another one. That's not the same thing they did. That's making sure it never happens again." Alvarez nodded slowly, though the weight of the coming mission still showed clearly on his face. Vect, the alien observer assigned to the fleet, spent much of his time studying the human crews around him, trying to understand what he was witnessing. He had expected the fleet's mood to shift as they approached their target, anger rising, tension building into something loud and volatile. Instead, he found the opposite. The closer they came to Vera, the calmer and more focused the crews became. Briefings were precise. Communication was clipped and professional. There was no chest beating, no dramatic declarations of vengeance. He mentioned this to Bello during one of their few private conversations. "Your people are unsettling," he admitted. "I have served alongside fleets preparing for battle before. There is usually noise, bravado, fear expressed as anger. Your crews show none of this." Bello allowed a small, humorless smile. "We learned a long time ago that the loudest reactions rarely win anything. Rage makes people careless. Careless people make mistakes, and mistakes cost lives. Ours and, sometimes, people who don't deserve to be caught in the middle. What you're seeing isn't calm because we don't care. It's calm because we care enough to make sure we do this right." Vecht said nothing further, but he found himself watching the crews with a new kind of attention, uneasy in a way he couldn't fully explain. A fleet driven by uncontrolled fury could be predicted, managed, even exploited. A fleet this disciplined, this quiet in its resolve, felt like something far more dangerous. 3 days before reaching Vera, diplomatic pressure intensified. Several allied species, worried about the precedent Earth's actions might set, requested one final round of talks. Secretary Osei, coordinating from Earth, agreed to hear them out, though she made Earth's position clear from the outset. "We are not seeking permission," she told the assembled representatives during a tense virtual meeting. "We are informing you, as a courtesy, of what is already underway." The Skarn Collective murdered civilians, including children, and faced no consequence from the body meant to prevent exactly this kind of atrocity. Earth will no longer treat that council's slow processes as an acceptable substitute for protecting our people. One representative, from a species with a long history of council leadership, pressed further. "And if other nations follow your example? If every species decides to act unilaterally whenever they feel wronged, what becomes of Galactic Order?" Osei's reply was measured but firm. Galactic Order should have prevented New Haven in the first place. It didn't. "We are not abandoning peace. We are simply refusing to let peace become another word for abandonment." The talks ended without resolution, but also without any formal action against Earth. Many species, privately, understood the reasoning, even if they could not publicly endorse it. The Council's failure at New Haven had embarrassed everyone who relied on its authority, and few wished to defend that failure too loudly. As the fleet entered the outer edge of the Vera system, sensors confirmed what scouts had already reported. A sprawling raider base, built into a cluster of hollowed-out asteroids, defended by a mix of ships and static weapon platforms. Dozens of smaller raider vessels moved between the asteroids, unaware that anything unusual was approaching. The Skarn Collective, confident in years of unchallenged raiding, had not expected retaliation on this scale, if they expected retaliation at all. Bello gathered her senior officers for a final briefing. Our priority is disabling their capacity to raid again. Ships, weapon platforms, command structures. We are not here to destroy the asteroid cluster wholesale, or harm anyone not directly involved in coordinating these attacks. Ground teams will secure command centers and detention areas. Intelligence suggests captives from previous raids may still be held there. And if they resist, one officer asked, then we respond with exactly the force required to stop that resistance, Bello said. No more, no less. We are not here to become what we're fighting. We're here to make sure it stops. Reyes, listening from the assembled ground team leaders, felt the weight of that instruction settle over him. It would have been easier, in some cold way, to simply unleash everything the fleet carried and be done with it. But he understood, as Bello clearly did, that the manner of their response mattered almost as much as the response itself. New Haven had been an atrocity. Whatever came next needed to be justice, precise, controlled, and final, not another atrocity wearing a different uniform. As the fleet moved into final attack position, Vecht found himself standing beside Bello on the bridge, watching the tactical display fill with markers representing raider vessels, defense platforms, and the fleet's own assault formations. They still don't know we're here, Vecht observed quietly. They will in a few minutes, Bello replied. Are you afraid? Vecht asked, the question slipping out before he fully considered it. Bello was quiet for a moment, her eyes fixed on the display, on the small marker representing the asteroid base where the people responsible for New Haven's slaughter believed themselves safe. I'm not afraid, she said finally. I'm certain there's a difference. She turned to her communications officer. Signal all ships. Begin the approach. Across the fleet, thousands of crew members moved to final positions, weapon systems powering to full readiness, ground assault teams sealing into transport shuttles. The calm that had defined the journey remained unbroken, but beneath it now ran a current of focused intent, 11 days of restraint finally reaching its end. On the asteroid base, Skarn lookouts monitoring routine sensor sweeps caught the first signs of the approaching fleet only moments before it would be too late to matter. Alarms began sounding through the base's corridors, raider crews scrambling toward their ships in sudden confusion and disbelief. For years, no one had dared bring a real fight to their doorstep. That certainty was about to be shattered completely. As the human fleet closed the final distance, Commander Bello allowed herself one last, quiet thought. Not of anger, not of vengeance, but of New Haven's small, makeshift graves, and the promise she intended to keep. Begin the operation, she said, and the quiet ended. The first strikes hit the raider fleet before most of the Skarn ships had even cleared their docking bays. Earth's forces moved with a precision that left little room for confusion or chaos. Fighter squadrons swept in first, targeting ships still powering up their engines, disabling weapons systems before they could be brought online. Larger cruisers took position around the asteroid cluster, cutting off escape routes with methodical efficiency. Within minutes, dozens of raider vessels sat dead in space, their crews stunned by how quickly their advantage had disappeared. Aboard the flagship, Commander Bello watched the tactical display update in real time, marker after marker shifting from active threat to neutralized. Casualties? She asked. Minimal on our side, Priya Anand reported. Their pilots didn't even have time to organize a real defense. It was not the desperate grinding battle some had expected. It was something colder and more absolute. The kind of overwhelming advantage that came from a fleet that had spent years quietly preparing for a moment it hoped would never come, but had trained for anyway. On the surface of the asteroid base, Sergeant Reyes led his ground team through a docking corridor breached moments earlier by advanced shuttles. Alarms blared through the metal hallways, red emergency lights casting long shadows as Skarn crew members scrambled between defensive positions and escape routes. Some raiders chose to fight. Most, faced with the speed and coordination of the assault, chose to surrender the moment resistance became clearly hopeless. Command centers 2 levels down, came the voice of Lieutenant Chen through Reyes's comm. Detention block reported near the lower docking ring. Command wants that secured immediately. Reyes split his team, sending half toward the command center, while he led the remainder toward the detention block. Private Alvarez, moving close behind him, kept his weapon raised but steady, the earlier hesitation from days before, replaced now by focused determination. They found the detention block guarded by only a handful of raiders, most of whom surrendered the moment Reyes's team breached the outer door. Inside, dozens of captives sat huddled in holding cells. survivors from previous raids on smaller colonies, some who had been held for months, waiting for ransom demands that had never been paid, or simply left to be forgotten. An older man near the front of one cell looked up as the door opened, flinching at first, then staring in disbelief as he registered the uniforms. "You're human," he said, his voice hoarse. "We are," Reyes confirmed, already moving to release the locking mechanisms. "You're safe now." The man let out a broken, exhausted laugh, more relief than joy. "We heard the alarms. We thought they were finally going to kill us before anyone came." "No one's killing anyone who isn't fighting back," Reyes said firmly, helping the man to his feet. "We're getting everyone out." As Reyes's team worked to free the captives, similar scenes played out across the asteroid base. Ground teams secured weapon stockpiles, disabled remaining defense systems, and rounded up raiders, who had abandoned any thought of resistance once it became clear how outmatched they were. The operation that the Skarn Collective's leadership had never imagined possible unfolded exactly as Bello had planned, swift, controlled, and nearly bloodless on the side of those carrying it out. The greatest resistance came from the base's command center, where a core group of Skarn leadership, including the raid's chief architect, a hardened commander known only as Drask, refused to surrender. Lieutenant Chen's team found themselves pinned down in a reinforced corridor, unable to advance without risking heavy casualties. Bello, monitoring the situation from the flagship, made the call herself. "Pull back from direct assault," she ordered. "Seal the corridor. We don't need to storm that room. We just need to make sure nothing gets out." Within the hour, the command center was fully isolated, its life support and power systems cut off from the rest of the base under Bello's direct order. No further soldiers were risked in a costly frontal assault. Drask and his remaining loyalists were left with a simple, unavoidable choice: surrender, or remain sealed away with dwindling resources until they had no choice at all. It took less than 6 hours for the doors to finally open, Drask emerging with his hands raised, flanked by the last of his officers. Reyes, called in to oversee the surrender, studied the man responsible for New Haven's destruction with a controlled, careful calm that surprised even himself. Part of him had expected fury, an overwhelming urge for vengeance now that the moment had finally come. Instead, he felt something quieter and, in its own way, more powerful. The simple, grim satisfaction of duty, finished properly. "You're the one who ordered New Haven," Reyes said, not quite a question. Drask lifted his chin, still defiant despite his situation. "Your colony was undefended, weak. We took what was available to be taken. That is how things have always worked." "Not anymore," Reyes replied evenly. "You're going to answer for what you did. Properly. Not with another massacre, even though you deserve one. With justice, since that's a word your kind never bothered learning." Drask said nothing further, and Reyes gestured for his team to move the prisoners into custody. There would be no summary execution, no retaliation carried out in matching cruelty to what had been done at New Haven. Bello's orders had been clear from the beginning. Those responsible would face formal justice, tried and held accountable through proper channels, not simply erased in an act that would mirror the very atrocity they were meant to answer for. Not every part of the operation went without cost. 3 human soldiers lost their lives during the assault, along with several pilots whose ships were caught in the initial exchange of fire. Their names would be added to the growing list that had begun with New Haven, a painful reminder that even a controlled, decisive operation carried real loss. But compared to the alternative, allowing the Skarn Collective to continue unchallenged, free to plan further attacks on colonies with even less defense than New Haven had possessed, the cost, while real, was one Bello and her command staff had been prepared to accept. Vecht, who had remained aboard the flagship throughout the operation, watched the final reports come in with a expression that mixed unease and something close to reluctant respect. He had expected brutality once the fighting began, expected the calm discipline he'd witnessed during the approach to shatter into something closer to vengeance once battle was actually joined. Instead, he had watched a fleet dismantle a hardened raider stronghold with almost surgical precision, minimizing unnecessary casualties on both sides, securing captives and prisoners alike with the same careful control. "You could have destroyed this entire base," he said quietly to Bello as the final reports of secured sectors came through. "Erased it completely. No one would have questioned it, given what they did." "That was never the goal," Bello replied, watching the last of the captured raiders being processed on the display before her. "The goal was to stop them, permanently, not to become something New Haven's survivors would need to be protected from as well. Vect considered this for a long moment. "Your people are strange," he finally said. "You wait, and wait, and wait, restrained far longer than most species would tolerate. And when you finally act, you do so with a force that should be terrifying. Yet you still choose restraint, even in victory." Bello allowed a tired, faint smile. "Maybe that's exactly why it works. We're not fighting to become monsters. We're fighting to make sure the actual monsters don't get another chance." Within the asteroid base's freed detention block, the rescued captives were slowly moved aboard human transport ships, given medical care, food, and the first real comfort many of them had experienced in months. Among them, Reyes found himself speaking again with the older man from earlier, who introduced himself as Daniel Ferris, a farmer taken from a small border colony nearly 8 months prior. "I didn't think anyone was coming," Ferris admitted quietly, as he was helped into a transport seat. "After a while, you stop hoping. It hurts less that way." "You don't have to stop hoping anymore," Reyes said. "Not now." Ferris studied him for a moment, something shifting in his exhausted expression. "You're not what I expected humans to be like. People talked about you as careful, cautious. Not this." Reyes considered the comment for a moment, before answering honestly. "We were careful. For a long time. Maybe too long. But careful doesn't mean weak. And patient doesn't mean we forget how to act when it matters." As the last transport ships departed the ruined asteroid base, Commander Bello stood on the flagship's bridge, reviewing the full operational report. The Skarn Collective's primary staging ground was fully neutralized. Its leadership, including Drask, was in custody, awaiting transfer to face formal charges before whatever tribunal the wider galactic community could agree to establish. Dozens of captives from multiple previous raids, some taken long before New Haven, had been freed and were now receiving care aboard the fleet. It was not a perfect victory. Lives had been lost on both sides. Nothing would undo what happened at New Haven, or bring back the people buried in its makeshift graves. But as she looked over the final numbers, raiders neutralized, captives freed, further attacks prevented, she allowed herself, for the first time since receiving the initial reports of the massacre, a moment of quiet, grim satisfaction. The message had been sent, not in words, but in action. Humanity's patience had limits, and those limits had finally been tested. Now it was time to make sure the entire galaxy understood exactly what that meant going forward. Part 5. News of the operation at Vera reached the Galactic Council before Commander Bello's fleet had even begun its journey home. Unlike the slow, careful reports that usually accompanied council business, this information spread fast, carried by traders, scouts, and independent observers who had watched the human fleet dismantle the Skarn Collective's stronghold in less than a day. The numbers alone were enough to shake the council chamber into stunned silence when they were finally read aloud. Raider fleet neutralized, primary base secured, dozens of long-held captives freed, and Drask, the mastermind of the New Haven massacre, taken alive and awaiting formal trial. The council convened an emergency session within hours, and the debate that followed was unlike any in recent memory. Some delegates rose immediately to condemn Earth's actions, insisting that unilateral military operations, regardless of cause, threatened the stability of the entire galactic order. Others, more hesitant, pointed out that the Council itself had failed to act while New Haven burned, and that its condemnation now would ring hollow to every species watching. "We cannot simply allow member nations to act outside our authority whenever they feel justified," argued one delegate, a senior representative from a species long central to Council leadership. "And we cannot ask member nations to wait indefinitely while their people are slaughtered," countered another. New Haven survivors waited 6 days for supplies. They received words instead of protection. Earth gave them justice in a single day. The argument stretched on for hours, but no formal condemnation was ever issued. Too many delegates, privately, understood the truth that none of them wished to say aloud in open session. The Council's own failure had created the conditions for what followed. To punish Earth for acting would mean publicly admitting that the Council's caution had cost lives it could have saved. Instead, the Council extended a formal, if carefully worded, request for Earth to present its position directly. Secretary Osei was chosen to deliver Earth's response, traveling to the Council's central chamber alongside a small delegation that included Ambassador Elena Cho, who had insisted on attending despite her exhaustion, and Commander Bello, freshly returned from Vera. The chamber was full the day they arrived. delegates from dozens of species watching closely as Osei stepped forward to address the assembly. She did not raise her voice. She did not offer dramatic gestures. Her words, delivered with the same calm precision that had defined Earth's entire response, carried more weight because of their restraint. 6 days ago, this council was asked for protection and offered procedure instead, she began. New Haven's people died, waiting for a response that never came in time to matter. We do not stand before you today to apologize for acting. We stand before you to explain why we no longer believe apology is owed. A murmur passed through the chamber, but Osei continued without pause. Earth has spent years operating within the boundaries this council established, trusting that patience and restraint would be met with fairness and protection in return. We kept our fleets modest in appearance. We followed every guideline, attended every session, honored every treaty. In return, when our people were slaughtered without warning, we were told to wait for proper procedure. She paused, letting the words settle before continuing. We will not apologize for refusing to wait any longer. We will not apologize for ensuring that those responsible for New Haven face justice rather than simply escaping to strike again elsewhere. What we will say is this: peace remains our preference. Diplomacy remains our first choice. But the protection of our people is not something we will ever again place behind bureaucratic caution. Ambassador Cho was invited to speak next, and though her voice remained steady, everyone in the chamber could hear the exhaustion and grief still present beneath her words. She described what she had witnessed at New Haven, not with dramatic language, but with the simple, devastating honesty of someone who had walked through the wreckage herself, who had buried colleagues and friends in the soft earth beside farms that no longer existed. I do not ask this council to celebrate what happened at Vera, she said quietly. War, even swift and controlled war, is not something to celebrate. I ask only that this council remember what inaction cost us, and consider whether procedure without protection is truly worth defending. When she finished, the chamber remained silent for a long moment before the presiding delegate finally spoke. The council will take your statements under consideration, he said, though even he seemed to understand how insufficient those words now sounded compared to what Earth had already done. In the weeks that followed, something subtle but undeniable shifted throughout the galactic community. Species who had once viewed Earth as a smaller, cautious power began treating human representatives with a new kind of careful respect. Trade negotiations that had once moved slowly suddenly found human delegates receiving more favorable terms, not through demands, but through a quiet recognition that Earth was no longer a nation to be taken lightly. Border colonies, belonging to other species, worried about facing threats similar to New Haven, began quietly requesting closer defense cooperation with Earth's forces. Drask's trial took place 3 months later, held under a newly established framework the Council agreed to create in the aftermath of the crisis, a framework specifically designed to allow faster, more decisive responses to attacks on civilian populations, without requiring the lengthy deliberation that had failed New Haven so completely. It was, in its own way, the Council's quiet admission that its old processes needed to change. Drask was found guilty and sentenced to permanent confinement, his network fully dismantled, his remaining followers scattered and stripped of the resources that had once allowed them to prey on undefended colonies. Back on New Haven, reconstruction had already begun. Earth sent engineers, medical teams, and supplies to help rebuild what had been lost, though everyone understood that some things could never truly be restored. The market square was rebuilt, though a small memorial now stood at its center, listing the names of everyone who had died in the attack. Children's laughter slowly returned to the colony's streets, though older residents still flinched sometimes at loud, sudden sounds. Sergeant Reyes returned to New Haven briefly before his next assignment, standing quietly before the memorial with Private Alvarez beside him. Alvarez read through the long list of names, his expression somber. Was it worth it? Alvarez asked quietly. What we did at Vera. Reyes considered the question carefully before answering. It didn't bring anyone back, he said. Nothing could do that. But somewhere out there, there's another colony that isn't going to end up on a list like this one, because the people who would have attacked it know now that we won't just wait around while they do it. That's worth something. Maybe not everything, but something. Alvarez nodded slowly, seeming to find some measure of peace in the answer. Elena Cho remained on New Haven as well, choosing to stay through the early stages of reconstruction, rather than return immediately to a comfortable posting elsewhere. She walked the rebuilt streets often, watching new buildings rise where ruins had once stood, watching survivors slowly rebuild lives that had been shattered in a single night. She thought often of the conversation she'd had with the council representative in the immediate aftermath of the attack, his insistence on procedure, even as people lay dying. She wondered if he ever thought about that conversation now, given everything that had followed. Commander Bello, meanwhile, found herself unexpectedly cast into a role she had never sought, a symbol, both within Earth and across the wider galactic community, of the moment humanity had stopped waiting for permission to protect its own people. She accepted the attention with the same quiet discomfort she brought to most things, more interested in returning to active duty than in being celebrated for what she still considered, at its core, a tragedy that should never have been necessary in the first place. Vect requested a permanent posting as a liaison between his people and Earth's forces, citing a professional interest in better understanding human military doctrine. Privately, he had come to see something in that final operation at Vera that he suspected many species would eventually need to understand. Not simply Earth's capability, but the particular, unsettling combination of patience and decisiveness that made humanity difficult to predict, and even more difficult to underestimate safely. Nearly a year after the attack, Earth issued a formal statement to the wider galactic community, delivered jointly by President Whitfield and Secretary Osei. It was brief, carefully worded, and unmistakably clear in its meaning. Earth remains committed to peace, cooperation, and the principles this council was founded to uphold, the statement read. We do not seek conflict, and we take no pleasure in the losses suffered on either side of what happened at Vera, but let this be understood clearly, now and going forward. The safety of our people will never again be placed second to procedure. We will act, swiftly and decisively, whenever that safety is threatened, regardless of how uncomfortable that action may be for those more concerned with appearances than outcomes. The statement closed with a single line that would be repeated, quoted, and remembered across the galaxy for years to come. We were patient because we chose to be, not because we were required to be. That choice remains ours, and so does the choice to stop. Far below, on New Haven, the memorial in the rebuilt market square caught the light of the setting sun. The names of the dead permanently etched into its surface, a quiet reminder of both what had been lost and what had finally changed because of it. Children played nearby once more, their laughter carrying across a colony slowly healing, protected now not just by hope, but by the certain knowledge that humanity's patience, however long it might last, was no longer something